So my name is Jessica Steinberg. I'm an assistant professor in international studies in the School of Global and International Studies here at IU. And I have the great privilege of moderating this panel. And so the way that I think we're going to move forward is that I will just introduce the panelists that will give their comments, and then I will sort of introduce as they give their comments. And then after we hear from each of our panelists, I will provide a few discussion questions to get us going, and then I look forward to questions from the members. So we're going to start with Professor Gardner Bovington, who is a professor here in the School of Global International Studies in the Department of Central Eurasian Studies, as well as International Studies, so a colleague of mine. And he received a PhD in politics from Cornell University and works on issues of nationalism, identity, Uyghurs in China, as well as teaches classes on oil, Islam, geopolitics. So I'm going to turn it over to him and look forward to his comments.
Okay, so I'm really glad to have the opportunity to be here to meet and talk with people. I'm also happy to see a number of faces that I know. It's always easier to speak to friends and familiar faces. So the topic of this conference is a happy one, sustainable development. And I missed the morning panels, but I'm assuming that they made everyone feel very good. I'm about to tell you some very depressing things. So if you want to keep your upbeat mood, now would be an excellent time to go and get coffee. So I've been invited to speak about traditional energy and sustainable development in Central Asia, which is a very important topic. And the first thing I want to say very clearly is that traditional energy has been, is, and will continue to be a main engine of economic growth and sustenance of states in that region for a long time. I think sustainable development in the best of places with the best of governments is still a happy dream rather than a near-term possibility. I think it's far more remote in Central Asia than in many other places in the world, despite the manifest riches of the place. I was reviewing, to prepare for this presentation, some writings by the International Crisis Group, and you can tell already if it's a crisis group, it doesn't want to give anyone good news. But its most recent summary of affairs in Central Asia suggested that Central Asia's physical infrastructure, a legacy from the Soviet Union, is essentially crumbling, and the various states are doing very little to do anything about that. The economies are still holdovers primarily from the Soviet period. You could say that Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan in particular have done a considerable amount to increase their capacity to produce and export energy. But in general, says the International Crisis Group, any dreams of economic diversification and modernization will have to be put on hold for the indefinite future. To me, diversification and modernization will be key to any plausible strategy for sustainable development. The ICG, in its executive summary, also suggests that there are possible ways of addressing the many problems in this region, problems standing in the way of modernization and economic diversification, and they boil them down to governance. And here I'm a little nervous about being recorded in a form available to the public, because people in Central Asia could watch me say that Central Asian governments are, by and large, not very functional. They are, in some cases, corrupt, and in other cases, astonishingly corrupt. They are beset by problems of patron-client relations, local accommodations to local difficulties. There are not really coherent national economic policies and plans. Kazakhstan, probably the best example of a government trying to establish and then carry out an economic plan for the future, engaged in some counter-cyclical spending over the last several years, infrastructure development and so forth. Nonetheless, it, of course, faces the problem of falling oil and gas prices, as do all of its neighbors. And there are other problems as well. The International Crisis Group says if we were to try to address the problems of decline in infrastructure and lack of any plausible plan to diversify economies, there are solutions available. And here's a quotation. The fundamental problem is that the vital prerequisites are steps that Central Asia's ruling elites are unwilling to take. Why, you might ask, are they unwilling to take them? Well, they say, again, I quote, these would amount to nothing less than a total repudiation of regional leaders' values and behavior. In other words, it will work fine as long as they stop doing everything they're doing and believing in everything that they say they believe in. They add International Crisis Group, since after all they're an organization dedicated to thinking about where the problem spots are in the world and what wealthy and powerful donors abroad can do about them. They add that donors could have some beneficent influence on the problems in the region, but they're in fact having very little. So my take-home message here is that things have not been going very well in Central Asia. The largest economies have been heavily dependent on energy. The problems with energy prices in the last few years have exacerbated those problems, and that as far as I can see, there is no credible plan for sustainable development. I want to come back at the end of what I'm going to say to some possible avenues for that. But I do want to point out, for instance, that probably the best economy in the region is that of Kazakhstan, and purchasing power parity figures put its GDP last year at around 400 billion. It is the richest in oil, and it has very substantial gas reserves, particularly in its west, which borders on the Caspian Sea, which, as many of you may know, has enormous quantities of still untapped petroleum reserves. It has the highest per capita GNP because it has a fairly small population of about 17 million. Turkmenistan has probably the second largest GDP per capita in purchasing power parity terms, probably something on the order of 60 or 70 billion. It's hard to say because Turkmenistan's government is famously economical with details about what's going on. In fact, after North Korea, it's probably the best candidate for the label of hermit kingdom. Turkmenistan has a population of about 9 million. Its neighbor Uzbekistan, about 30 million. By population, the largest country in the region, has a still smaller economy, an economy probably producing about a third to a quarter of that of Kazakhstan. So you can see where this is going. GNP per capita is going down and down. So Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan share large gas reserves. Turkmenistan, of course, also borders on the Caspian Sea, and it has been and will continue to, has been exploiting and will continue to exploit gas reserves. The Soviet system built pipelines into Kazakhstan and into Turkmenistan back when they were republics. Those pipelines persist, but in recent years, in about the last 10 years, China has built and is now enjoying the proceeds of an oil pipeline that goes to Kazakhstan, a gas pipeline that goes to Turkmenistan. Those are sustaining, of course, China's still fairly rapid growth, and they are providing large incomes for the governments of these Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, as I mentioned. I mentioned corruption before. One problem is that the energy industries in both of these countries, and also in Uzbekistan, are state-controlled, and to be honest, even in front of a camera, state-controlled really means controlled by the family and the cronies of the ruling leaders of these countries. The Panama Papers have already revealed, and will probably continue to reveal new surprises about, the socking away of great personal wealth by members of these families. And that is an old story. It didn't take the Panama Papers to learn that the leaders of Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan had been putting wealth away abroad. Uzbekistan also exports some gas. Finally, the two smallest countries and the poorest countries, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, have very few mineral resources to export. Their main source of wealth to export is water. And the old Soviet system worked fairly well. The Soviet system, of course, treated Central Asia as one economic unit with some asterisks after that. And it was designed to create economies from exchanges among the countries, and also, of course, oriented their energy exports and other exports, as I suggested before, into the Soviet heartland. The disintegration of the Soviet Union cost them dear because some of the countries, like Kazakhstan, had depended on Soviet subsidies of about 25% of their annual budgets. Kyrgyzstan depended on about 50% subsidies. Those went away, and the economies really came to the verge of collapse in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Soviet Union. All of them have made modest progress since, but Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan continue to be the poorest countries, and they are beset by a logistical problem as well as an economic problem. Their water flows principally into Uzbekistan, so into Kazakhstan. And the old arrangement was that Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan would provide water, mainly to Uzbekistan, in the summer, and then in the winter, Uzbekistan and sometimes Kazakhstan would provide coal, oil, and electricity to these mountainous countries in the winter. Periodically, Uzbekistan in particular has decided in recent years it would be cute to either renegotiate prices, which was a very difficult thing, or simply to cut off supplies on the complaint that Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan were not paying their bills or were not being good citizens. Also, these two mountainous countries have had an interest in letting water go from their dams in periods when they were worried about flooding. And precisely because of those worries, the downstream country, Uzbekistan, has not wanted them to let that water go. And this has been a source of further concerns. Finally, those of you who know something about the geography of Central Asia know the sad story of the Aral Sea. The Aral Sea is fed by the Amudarya and the Sirdarya rivers, which originate, respectively, in the regions of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And I said before that the Soviet Union treated all of Central Asia as one economic zone. In truth, Uzbekistan was targeted specifically for cotton production, and the heavy emphasis on firstly cotton production in Uzbekistan led to desertification of its part of the Aral Sea. Kazakhstan did not much better, and today the Aral Sea is a shadow of its former self. It is increasingly salty. It no longer sustains many of the industries on or around it. This is an ecological disaster that could be addressed by greater cooperation among these countries, and has not been, unfortunately, because they don't really see interests in common. So, the prospects for growth in energy supplies and economic growth in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are heavily dependent on building more dams or developing other products to export. Dam building requires investments. They don't have a lot of money to invest. They have depended heavily on foreign donors. Unfortunately, as I was not here this morning, I didn't hear whether it was brought up, but of course, damming on the one hand seems like a mode of sustainable development. On the other hand, many ecologists have urged in recent years that we not think about hydropower as a major source because it's so disruptive of local lifestyles, local flora and fauna, and so forth. So it would be good for their energy economies and their economies as a whole if they could build more dams that may not be good for their prospects of sustainable development. When we come to the other countries, it would be nice if these countries had collected sovereign wealth funds and had established clear plans for developing solar, wind, and other forms of energy. Most of them have talked about it. Most of them have done very little about it. Kazakhstan probably has had the largest sovereign wealth fund. It used most of that for the counter-cyclical spending on infrastructure that I talked about before. Okay. I said at the end I would offer some few bright spots. Kazakhstan, as you may know, is a very large country by area. It has, I think it is the 9th largest country by area in the world, maybe the 6th. There's a lot of space. There are a lot of windy places where it'd be very easy to set up, for instance, wind farms. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have some very sunny places. It would be very easy, it seems to me, to set up solar farms as well. That would take capital, and the capital, let's be frank, is not going to come from inside. Because most of the elites are tied to existing patterns of economic development, you might even say underdevelopment, and these structures of patron-client relations that sustain the parties in power, that sustain local elites, and in fact sustain the lifestyles of many people, are extremely brittle and would not respond well to strong movements toward alternate economic arrangements. Right? So there is a lot of potential, I think, for changing to different modes of energy production. And there is great potential also for economic transition. Unfortunately, I think the political configurations of the governments in the region militate against likely resolutions to those things. So sorry for the rather downbeat message. That is what I have to say about Central Asia.
Thank you very much, Garth. So we'll move on to our next panelist. Actually, I think we're meant to go in alphabetical order. So I think that leads us to Professor Rizwan Nadeem, who is a professor at the Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and Environment and the Department of Nuclear, Plasma, and Radiological Engineering at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where he also received a PhD in nuclear engineering and continues to write on questions of sort of measuring sustainability, particularly when it comes to sort of the immediate and engineering costs and benefits of different energy sources. So, forward to your comments.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for coming. There are going to be three very different talks, I suppose, here, and hopefully we'll integrate them in the QA session. So let me just talk about, what I said. I'll talk about coal versus nuclear, and I don't even know. We don't know whether nuclear should fall in traditional sources of energy, or is it a alternative and modern new form of energy. But we will treat nuclear somewhere in the middle, and I'll basically address the question as to why. So move forward. So let me just say a couple of words about sustainability before we come to the nuclear part. It's very difficult to define. Everybody claims sustainability, and somebody would come back and say, you think that thing that you are doing, that you are claiming to be sustainable, how many gallons of water it takes to actually produce that sustainable source of whatever you're claiming to be sustainable. But there is no easy way of actually defining what is sustainable. And people are not coming to agree to some common definition. So this is the great need of the time, actually, for some people to actually take the problem head on and come up with a definition which will allow different comparison between different sources of energy, or different kinds of meat, different kinds of food, different kind of infrastructure. And this particular case of coal versus nuclear will actually highlight that particular point when we get to that point. So a few definitions that you can probably see on the screen. Something that improves the quality of human life by living within the carrying capacity of supporting economic system. So ecosystem. If you Google sustainability, definition of sustainability, tons of things will come up. But these are two definitions that you see up there. The second one being sustainability encompasses the principle, it has this notion of indefinitely perpetuating. But ideally, nothing will be sustainable in that sense. I mean, if you keep using iron, if you keep digging it out from the ground, at some point, you're going to run out of iron. Same thing with coal and oil. But what is the timeline that we talk about? That becomes very important. So anyway, that is a debate that can go on for hours and days and months. So we're not going to solve that problem now. But this is something that is actually very, very critical. Something else that you notice, I don't know if you can see how clearly you can see the part that I highlighted down at the bottom left corner. This is an article that appeared in the latest issue of Science, Engage Key Social Concepts for Sustainability. So not only scientists and engineers, but the social scientists have many other kinds of issues that they would like to bring in, which are not being included currently in the definition of sustainability. So this is the issue from April 1st of 2016, Science issue. And if we move forward, you can see this thing there that maybe this is not something that you should talk about in a business school, sitting in a business school, but tracking only economic growth has been detrimental to social and environmental progress. Business people usually track it, with those kind of indicators. But then this particular set of people who wrote this paper, they have actually given, I think, 9 or 12 different social indicators that should be included in the definition of sustainability, from values to the inequality. And so how would a particular technology, or how would a particular infrastructure lead to better equality is being suggested as a measure of sustainability. And I think there are some very, very good points that need to be taken into account by scientists and engineers on one hand, business people on the other hand, and then the social scientists who are proposing these. I think they all need to come to the table to come up with a very consistent definition of sustainability. So, outline of the talk. Coal versus nuclear, basically I'll talk about why nuclear and why not nuclear, and why coal, why not coal, and then the challenge of comparing the two. That should be taken as an example of what is the big challenge when we talk about sustainability. How do we compare, okay, different options that are available to us? So if you move forward with, what is nuclear and why nuclear? Very quickly, so nuclear has seen its ups and downs. So it was a big thing in the 60s, 70s, then TMI happened, it started to go down, then Chernobyl happened in '86, it got another hit, it sort of led, dormant for about 10, 15 years. Then just before Fukushima, it had started to come back in a very big way. Partly pushed by the CO2 concern, partly because of economics. The oil is over $100 a barrel, and then all of a sudden nuclear was looking very, very promising. Then Fukushima happened, and then fracking and other economic factors that have started to come also, and impact the growth of nuclear. So there's a big difference between nuclear in US and nuclear in, say, China and India, and some of the other developing countries like UAE. So compare nuclear produced electricity versus coal and gas produced electricity. Coal, gas being traditional sources, fossil, and nuclear being, let's say, one of the modern ones. So here's the comparison. For those who know, this is the only place where you will see numbers, I guess, in this presentation. But I've tried to keep all the equations out, although you do see one chemical reaction. But the highlighted part is that when a chemical reaction takes place, when you burn coal or when you burn gas, when you take one methane, one little part of coal, and you burn it, you get about 10 units of energy, 10 eV. Okay. When you do a similar kind of thing with the nuclear energy, that is when you take uranium and you split in a nucleus of uranium, you get about 200 million units of energy, electron volts. So 10 versus 200 million. That is the big thing that will keep bringing nuclear back, because it's a very, very concentrated source of energy. So if you have some small amount of a kilogram of uranium, that's a lot of energy in there. Okay. So despite the fact, despite accidents, despite whatever happens, despite all the other problems that nuclear has, it just keeps coming back because of this one point, that it's a lot of energy that is concentrated. Countries that have nuclear fuel in their ground, whether it's India or places like Australia does not have nuclear power, but Canada does. They have uranium, so why not use that to produce electricity? So quick comparison: 1 kilogram of uranium will give you the same amount of energy as about 14,000 barrels of oil and 3,000 tons of coal. Okay, so that's the big draw of nuclear. Why not nuclear? Of course, we know most of those things, but then the comparison with other sources will become a little more complicated. So waste, safety, and cost. These are the three things. Cost, in a business school, I shouldn't be talking about it because everybody understands that if you do not compete in the marketplace, then you are out. But what about waste issue and safety issue? Safety, we also know. Okay, so every time some major nuclear accident happens, it is a big hit. But then one should be able to do an objective comparison of those concerns. For example, let me talk about waste here. Okay, so when nuclear reaction takes place, you have this waste, highly radioactive, but very concentrated. Okay, that comes out. When we burn coal or oil, we get CO2. Okay, how much? How much of each is produced, and how bad it is, and how long-lived it is. That's what will make the comparison challenge so much more acute, that it is nearly impossible to do that comparison. Okay. So the equation that's up there is cesium. Cesium has a half-life of 30 years. It's radioactive. It's very bad. Okay. So you want to control it. You want to make sure that cesium that is produced in a nuclear reaction, in a nuclear power plant, does not get out into the open atmosphere. Does not get into the soil, does not get into water, air. Okay, but it's very concentrated. The whole French waste is buried under basketball courts, 2 basketball courts, okay, underground. That's it. Okay, for the last 40 years. If you can handle it, that may be, is that better or worse than what you will get when you have CO2. You know how much CO2 was produced in 2014? 40 gigatons. 40 gigatons of CO2 by burning coal and other fossils. It's a lot of zeros after 40, okay? Plus, it's tons, and we have no control over it. It's already out in the atmosphere. The global warming that is taking place and all the impact of global warming, the genie is out of the bottle, whereas the other genie is still in some form, the nuclear genie is still controllable in some form, I suppose. So these are the things that will make things very difficult to compare. For example, we will hear more about Fukushima and other possible accidents that have happened or possibly may happen. How many people know, other than you, how many people died in the tsunami that happened in Fukushima? About 20,000. 20,000 people died in that tsunami event because of the tsunami. How many deaths can be attributed to the Fukushima nuclear accident, which was by far the worst accident so far that we have seen?
Not just the two. We still haven't counted the result of the stuff that is moving out. It's not over yet.
Yeah.
It's not over. Sure. No. So that's the challenge of counting. Okay. So in today's world, actually, you can see numbers which will tell you that actually less number of people die because of radiation from nuclear power plant than from coal plants.
I heard that 1 million people died from Chernobyl.
1 million?
Yeah, 1 million. Because of cancer. Over 30 years.
Yeah.
That's what I heard. One researcher said, but I don't know, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That to me sounds little.
The debate is not over yet.
Exactly.
Just of all these three accidents, Chernobyl was a horribly designed, unsafe plant from the get-go. The release was very large.
Correct.
They're not equivalent releases.
Definitely no. Yeah, there's no equivalent. TMI has essentially very little. It was completely controlled, whereas Chernobyl and Fukushima, the radiation got out. And so, how do you calculate it? Where do you come to the conclusion as to what is the number of deaths or how much radiation? So, if you do, if you leave aside the deaths part, which is not just the amount of radiation that you and I receive by living in okay? How much radiation that we receive comes from nuclear plants, and how much we get from coal plants? Which one do you think is higher? Coal is actually higher, because all of that radiation that you burn with this, 3,000 tons of coal, and you know how much coal we burn at one coal plant. You need one train full, not one cart full, one train full of coal coming to the plant every day. Okay, and then all of that gets burned. CO2 gets out, and the amount of radiation that is released by burning that coal is actually higher than the amount of radiation that is released from an equivalent nuclear power plant, which is producing the same amount of electricity by burning nuclear fuel. So, my question is not so much to debate about that, which one is easier or which one is better, which one is worse, but how do we compare these two things? Okay? That's the challenge, and that's what we need to come to some grip with to decide. And what is the worst case scenario, for example? Nuclear's worst case scenario can be much worse than the coal worst case scenarios. Right? Coal plant. What is the worst thing that can happen? Okay, not as bad as what can happen with the nuclear complex. Obviously, we know that. Right? So let me make sure that I at least cover. So here you have, this is the sheet that I get every year from my utility, and it gives me the numbers for the amount of different waste products that were produced. When I got, what's the number, 1,000 kilowatt hour of energy produced that was delivered to my home. If that 1,000 kilowatt hour of energy was produced using coal, then that would have led to 1,700 pounds of CO2. Okay. 1.25 pounds of nitrogen oxide, so much sulfur. But if that was produced using nuclear power plant, then the amount of nuclear waste produced was, high-level nuclear waste is 0.0008 pounds, and low-level nuclear waste is 0.0002 feet cubed. Okay. I get this sheet from my utility every year. How do you go about comparing the very, very nasty nuclear waste, but 0.0008 pounds of it, versus 2,000 pounds of CO2 that's already out in the atmosphere? So, I think I should stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, on to our final panelist, Dr. Vivian Bucci, who received her PhD from the University of Delaware in environmental policy, and whose most recent book has come out just this past year, Post-Fukushima Energy Policy in Japan and Policy and Market Review on SWOT Analysis for Preventing Renewable Energy in Demand, right? So it's a long title. And it's just come out, and she also writes and lectures in areas of environmental policy, and has just recently also started a nonprofit group aimed at called Blue Eggs Environmental Education, aimed at educating students on environmental issues. So welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited. And I'm originally from Japan. I came to the United States like 15 years ago, and as an exchange student at Virginia Tech. At that time, I studied architecture, but I'm like, oh, I have to study energy and environment. So I went to University of Delaware to get my degree. And today I'd like to talk about whether Japan has been moving toward a sustainable future after Fukushima disaster 5 years ago, 2011. So March 11, 5 years ago, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan hit, off the coast of Japan, and it triggered tsunami, devastating tsunami on the coast, and the tsunami waves reached up to 133 feet high, and as the professor said, it killed 20,000 people. And as all you know, it triggered a Fukushima nuclear disaster. And this is where the Fukushima power plant is located, and it's about 150 miles from Tokyo area, where 13 million people live. And from here to Chicago, it's about 220 miles, so it's closer than that distance. And so you can tell how close those locations are. And Fukushima nuclear accidents involve the meltdown of 3 reactors and immediate release of radioactive materials, and it became the second worst nuclear disaster after the Chernobyl. And Japan is still struggling cleanup efforts, and it's not still under control. And the Fukushima disaster was big enough to change Japan's energy policy. And before, this graph shows the energy sources for electricity generation before Fukushima, and Japan depends on 60% on fossil fuels, and 30%, about 1/3, on nuclear power generation. Japan wanted to expand nuclear power generation up to 50% by 2030 by adding, constructing 14 new reactors by 2030. But it changed after of course, after the disaster. And the Prime Minister at the time, Mr. Khan, said that, announced that Japan will end nuclear power generation and increase renewables from current 10% to 20% by 2020. And right after that, he stopped all the reactors. He ordered to stop all the reactors for safety checkup. And by September 2013, Japan gradually stopped the reactors, and by September 2013, Japan had 0 nuclear generation. But they didn't have any, blackout or anything. And he tried to expand renewable energy, and he expanded the feed-in tariff program to boost renewable energy. And this program allows renewable energy suppliers to sell their energy to the utility company at fixed rate for like a 10 to 20 long-term period. So because this was very effective, and especially for the PV generation, and it jumped 7 times in less than 4 years. But the policy changed, and Mr. Khan has to resign because of the criticism of lack of leadership after the earthquake, and he has to resign. And the current Mr. Abe administration was born, and he has been pushing for the pro-nuclear plan since then, since December 2012, saying that ending nuclear generation is irresponsible. Japan needs to increase up to 22% of nuclear generation by 2030. And he's been pushing this program. He tried to restart nuclear reactors since then. And of course, there are so many anti-nuclear demonstrations going on, and so many protests were held since then. And last year poll shows that over 70% of the public is against restarting nuclear power reactors. But he just restarted in August 2015, last year. And he did, regardless of the public interest. And there are right now 24 reactors waiting for restart approval. And so why the changes in direction happen all of a sudden? So one of the main reasons is the soaring cost of electricity generation. Japan replaced lost electricity generation from nuclear with fossil fuels. So their dependency rate on fossil fuels increased from 60% to 90%. And Japan doesn't have domestic fossil fuels. So we have to import all of those. So in the end, energy cost increased by $30 billion in a year. So, and of course the electricity prices increased. For example, energy sector, residential sectors increased in 25%, and industrial sector 40% increase. Japan's economy has been stagnated for a long time, so the soaring cost of electricity generation having a damaging effects on Japan's economy. So this is one of the reasons. Of course, and because Japan has to use more fossil fuels, the CO2 problem, it has been increasing significantly. So this is one of the reasons. And the second reason is powerful nuclear lobbying. Japan has many nuclear, pro-nuclear advocates in every sector. And they keep saying that the nuclear power generation is safe, cheap, and reliable, even after the Fukushima. And of course, the core reason is money. The nuclear industry can receive $20 billion profits a year, and the local governments can receive billions of dollars of subsidy by having nuclear power reactors in their areas. And the utility farms can get $3 billion of profit for a year for each plant. So they all need and benefit from having nuclear energy. So under such pro-nuclear administration, of course, renewable energy is promoting renewable energy is having a hard time, and it lacks a policy frame that protects renewables within conventional, fossil fuel-based market and fossil fuel and nuclear-based market, and specific target and roadmap for renewables are not set, and in the end, it allows power utility to prioritize nuclear power generation and fossil fuel generation over renewables. But it's also true that the opportunities are being created after the Fukushima, and people started showing a keen interest in clean and safe, which is renewable energy. And in business sector, for example, the number of utility farms, the number of non-utility farms that entered electric power businesses significantly increased, increased 7 times in 2 years. For example, this is a SoftBank Group, which is one of the major telecommunication company. They entered renewable energy business 6 months after the disaster, and now it grew to produce 350 million kilowatt hours of renewable energy, and it is big enough to supply 46,000 people. And also the utility scale, companies started to install utility scale PV plants. And this is Kyocera. Kyocera last year installed world's largest floating solar power plant in Japan. It's on the pond. It's floating. It's the world's largest. They just finished constructing last year, and Japan, along with other 5 companies, IBM Japan, has been working on constructing the world's 6th largest solar PV power plants in Japan. And so the amount of installed PV electricity increased 7 times in less than 2 years. Local governments and communities also showed interest in installing renewables by adopting the idea of local production for local consumption. For example, in Tottori City, in Tottori Prefecture, people used to buy electricity from big utility company, out-of-state big utility company, which mostly used fossil fuels and nuclear power. But after the disaster, they started to explore their own energy, which is mostly from renewables, and they started to supply those energy to residents through newly established city-owned power utility. And usually, so that the residents can use their own locally produced electricity. And money also, money didn't stay in the state, in the city before this one, but after this program, the money also stayed in the city. So they are benefited financially and electricity-wise. And these days, the power market has started being deregulated, and Japan's power market has been pretty monopolized, and it was very closed. But it's starting being deregulated. I don't go over details here today. So back to the original question, whether Japan has to move toward a sustainable future. And in my opinion, as long as Japan is obsessed, with nuclear power, I don't think they can invite a sustainable future because it's too dangerous. And it values money over people's health and environmental prosperity. And it just lacks ethical responsibility to the future generation. I have kids. I have 2 kids, and I don't let them live close to the nuclear power plant. So but some people have to do that. That's not ethically responsible. That's my opinion. And some people say that the renewable energy is not cost competitive, and it's not reliable. So it's reliable, and it's not realistic choices that some countries in Europe show that it's possible. For example, Denmark, they used to have very advanced nuclear research, but they just stopped doing that and moved toward a renewable path. And right now, last year they generated 42% by wind. Then they are on the path to generate 100% by 2050. 100% renewables by 2050. How wonderful! And Germany, they also had nuclear power. They depended like more than 20% on nuclear power, but after the disaster, they just decided not to pursue nuclear power, and they started strengthening renewable energy, and they are now generating 32% by renewables, and now aiming at 45% by 2030. So those cases showing that the building a strong economy with renewable is possible. So why not Japan? So that's my question and my hope. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to start with what maybe sort of a question that I've been thinking about since our introduction this morning, which is that in the context of traditional resources, the notion of sustainability is somewhat, at least in a very strict sense, somewhat contested. The idea that most of our traditional concepts of energy come from fixed or finite amounts of resources, and therefore thus could not possibly be, in a very strict sense, any degree of sustainable. But I think there's sort of room for maneuvering given the sort of variation in what we think of as sustainable. In particular, I think that one thing that's come out so far is that sustainability necessarily entails trade-offs, right? It entails trade-offs across space, potentially within the same country. It entails trade-offs across different kinds of priorities, whether those be social, economic, or environmental. And it entails temporal trade-offs, right, between the now and the future. And so that leads me to the question of the idea of what we measure with respect to sustainability depends on which trade-offs you think are relevant. Which then leads me to ask, given the sort of breadth of expertise we have here, how the sort of regional, geographic, or political context in which you work or think or operate shapes the sort of trade-offs that are particularly relevant for thinking about sustainability when it comes to traditional resources. So I'd love to hear sort of how that sort of notion of sustainability as the relevant trade-off is shaped, and therefore what is measured is shaped by either the geographic political context in which you sort of think or operate, or even the issue area in which you are invested or exploring. So,
since I have the least data, I'd love to start. I think that's a fantastic way to put it. I regret not mentioning Central Asia's near neighbor to the east in the course of my presentation. China has actually attempted, while maintaining a monopoly on the energy sector and while being heavily dependent on coal, oil, and natural gas, to create a burgeoning sector of renewable energy with a heavy emphasis on wind and water. It has done so because, of course, the state still controls the commanding heights of the economy, and it can subsidize what it wants to promote. Right? So rather than shunting aside or harming the interests of traditional energy producers, it's added a new sector. And in fact, the story of the collapse of Solyndra in the United States is partly a story about heavily subsidized photovoltaic solar cell production in China. It's a fantastic way to set up the question because, of course, the Soviet political system was premised on the idea that there were no costs. It was all benefit. Right? In other words, the public discourse was premised on the idea that it was all good, to use an idiom of our day. And there were lots of hidden taxes and there were hidden subsidies. And in fact, the decimation of the RLC was in part one of the hidden and increasingly hard to hide costs of Soviet energy and water intensive economic development in which water had no cost. Right? And many of you who know something about the environmental devastation left behind by the Soviet Union also know that the quality of clean air, the quality of clean water, and so forth was not monetized, and there was very little constituency to represent it and defend it. One of the problems in addressing this question in Central Asia is that all of these countries have poor data, and some of them have truly lousy data. Right? So I'm really envious of my distinguished colleagues here who can give scientific, and I want to say, in the main, disinterested presentations. Disinterested meaning unbiased, right? So both of you have talked about politics, you've talked about the difficulty of commensuration. How do you commensurate the palpable and highly dispersed consequences of coal burning versus the somewhat hard to calculate and highly concentrated problems with nuclear energy? How do you explain Abe Shinzo's decision to go against popular opinion and persist with nuclear energy, especially not only with the memory of Fukushima, but also with Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the past, right? It's astonishing. In both cases, I presume, Professor Guzan, you're mainly talking about the West, where the science and the policy of nuclear energy is somewhat transparent, shall we say. I think of Japan also as being transparent. In Central Asia, you have low to almost no transparency. In that context, how do you commensurate costs and benefits? How can there be any discussion of this? And in fact, one thing I didn't mention, but should be clear, all of the countries in Central Asia have and continue to subsidize the cost of energy. Right? It's artificially low. Now, they also ration it. In Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, there are regular blackouts. There's got to be a monetary cost associated with it for people who actually are engaged in productive activity. Can't be sustained when the electricity's off. But so, a big part of the way you've nicely set up the problem is exceedingly hard to address in this place. I also want to mention one fun thing that I observed last summer when I was in Almaty. Almaty is the second, it's now officially the second city in Kazakhstan. It's still the largest city and it's still the center of economic growth in the country. The government had the bright idea of following the trend of many world cities of setting up a pool of public bicycles. Now, I don't know whether any of you have ever been to Almaty. It has one big problem. And you could do it like that. Sorry, that's not a Nazi salute. That's the topography of the city of Almaty. It goes from high to low. Right? So they set up the bicycle sharing along the high line of the city, right, where you can go east-west without any problem. They haven't yet addressed the problem of what you're going to do when people want to ride bicycles downhill and no one wants to ride them back uphill. But they also didn't consider one big problem, which is in order to reduce traffic deaths, the Solons of the city created a big barrier along one of the main north-south thoroughfares in the middle of this bicycle share zone. And so you have two walls right in front of the bicycle paths. And so there are now satirical pictures on the web of great idea for bicycle share, except people can't get from this side to that side in the middle of your path, right? So in many cases, it seems, either there is no accounting of true costs and true benefits, or there are projects that patently show people haven't thought these through. There are very few avenues for engaging in a discussion of how much it might be sensible to subsidize renewable energy as an alternative to these sources. Because that would require discussions, first of all, of where the profits from existing energy production go, and second of all, where the costs are addressed. So thank you very much for setting up that way.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. That is the bottom line trade-off. Right? And different societies, different cultures, they respond differently. So how do you explain even despite Fukushima, there are other societies like UAE and Egypt and Turkey. They're all considering nuclear because nuclear also comes with a certain amount of prestige. For example, in some societies, that okay, now we have nuclear power. It is seen as okay, either we can have a space exploration program or nuclear. These are two technologies that are seen as technologies that can bring national pride to some societies. And just imagine, what's going on in UAE. It's a small, tiny country with a very concentrated population right along the shore, and there are going to be 4 nuclear power plants there. And but the society is, well, it's a very close society, but still, I think it looks like they're happy. The decision has been made from the top down. But if you talk to people, there is no strong opposition to that decision, partly because of this phenomena that they see this as a thing of national pride for them. That okay, we will have nuclear power. So this trade-off is exactly what. So the reason why French ended up with almost 75% of their electricity coming from nuclear was because they don't have any coal like Germany and other countries. They don't have any oil. They don't have any gas. So they were so heavily dependent that the embargo of the 1970s, they decided, And the same reason was for Japan as well. Japan does not have domestic resources of fossil fuel. So Japan decided that in order to have energy independence, so we are not cut off by somebody blockading us, decided that we should produce a certain amount. In the French case, it just went too high. They've decided also that they want to go back to at least 50% in after Fukushima, and maybe even lower. And that's a debate that is taking place even in Western Europe and other societies. And many societies, I believe, will go down with their percentage of nuclear in some gradual fashion. And as renewables become more economically competitive, I'm sure the share of renewable will continue to rise. In the long run, my personal belief, 100, 200 years from now, once we have solved the energy storage problem, I think there's no reason to not produce as much pure energy as possible from solar and wind. Why not? Because I don't know if we can still go back to the slides. I had one slide, I think near the end of my talk, which may still be there, and that so accurately describes the problem. Currently, the problem is, these are just not reliable all the time. I mean, you need base load so that when the wind stops blowing, what do? You do need to start up your gas plant or nuclear or coal or something. Or what do you do at night? And so once that energy storage problem is solved, and the Sahara has been, that picture, exactly. So this is the Germany's wind power capacity and production. Look at the top line, the sort of horizontal line, that is showing you the capacity. Okay, and the chaotic blue thing is the minute-to-minute production of wind power, wind-produced energy. So, you can see that it can go to very, very high values, and then 5 minutes later, the wind starts blowing. So, you need to provide a continuous supply of energy. You cannot have an industry or domestic consumption of energy based on this kind of supply line. So, I believe in the next 50, so scientists and engineers are working hard on if somebody can come up with a economical battery that can store tons and tons of energy, that will boost renewables significantly, and the cost has to come down just a little bit more.
Can I just, one thing about Germany, when they did this rapid transformation, I have friends that work at RWE, that work at the utility, and during the day, they so much solar, for example, when we come on, they were paying utilities in neighboring countries to take their excess power, because you and I speak the same language on storage. And then during the evenings, they were having to buy back power, and that is not economically sustainable. So there, these trade-offs. Again, you poke a stick in one place of the system, you really do have to figure out what you're going to do where that poke comes out the other side. So it's now interestingly, because here in the U.S., another thing I know about Germany, this is anecdotal, that here reliability is king. We want 100% reliable power. People in Germany, their reliability went down during this transition. But it was interesting to me, and people went, yeah, sometimes my lights go out. I guess it's the price we pay, which I thought was very interesting, that transformation in the way they thought about reliability. It's just in the
Exactly, the trade-off, right? So they, in order to not depend so much on nuclear power, they were happy to live with this slight amount of inconvenience, only in the transition. I think in the long run, even that made sense. Yes.
So, question regarding nuclear power. I've heard that there's an advantage of using thorium over uranium. While it's maybe not as energy efficient, it cannot be weaponized. And so that global arrangement that has some advantages. Also, secondly, is there any work being done in U of I in terms of large-scale grid-based energy storage?
In terms of?
Large-scale gigawatt, megawatt size energy storage.
Storage.
Yeah.
So let me mention the thorium part first. The thorium part, yes, thorium is a fuel of choice for many people because it addresses the proliferation issues, and also actually if you go back to the early 60s, late 50s, when the decision was made to go the uranium way, that was partly driven by actually the need for weaponization material. So you develop that technology, you develop uranium, then you can get plutonium, and plutonium can be used for other things. And there's a lot more thorium in the world. That's why India, which is I think the largest repository of thorium in the world, is working very heavily on that aspect of fuel cycle, nuclear fuel cycle, where thorium will get used to produce energy. And that will also address as you said, the proliferation issues. Coming to the storage part, I think it would be difficult to imagine any major university where somebody is not looking at this problem, but it has been a very, very challenging problem to store large gigawatt level of gigawatt hour level of energy. The work has been going on, but I don't see a big silver line right now, other than very conventional means. So if you have a mountain, there's a lake up there, you can pump water up there, those kind of things. Molten salt has been looked at. They all come down to, sitting in a business school, once it becomes, at what point does it become economically competitive? So that the investment that you put in the technology that you have developed is actually viable. We are not there yet. Though, yes, we do are working in those areas.
Question to Razwan. On the costs that you showed for uranium compared to coal, I'm wondering, do you include in your calculations the cost of purifying uranium and the energy used to increase the density so that it is usable for fuel? Or are you starting from the reactor?
No. The uranium cycle, so you have to buy the uranium in open market. Somebody private firm is going to supply you with the uranium fuel.
So there is a CO2 cost associated with purifying that uranium.
Sure.
It's not included in your car.
It is not included to the extent that the amount of fuel that is used to transport coal, for example, from the mine up to the coal burning plant is not included.
Scale. I'm just questioning the quality of the data.
No, sure.
If you want to be accurate, let's be accurate.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
And then what's the cost of now we're dealing with not having to eat tuna? You're not supposed to eat sushi in California because of the contamination.
No, I agree with you. How do you quantify this? Okay, so I'm not comparing nuclear at this point with renewables because that would be a purely economical decision. Okay, once you are willing to pay the slightly higher price of renewable, society can decide, like the Germans did, that okay, we don't want nuclear.
Yeah, but the decision has to be based on informed data, and the problem I don't think there is proper information.
Oh, the other one, from the coal
I mean, the Central Asians can do whatever they want to do, or Egypt.
Yeah.
I shudder to think
Or
of a
Turkey.
nuclear. Of a nuclear reactor in Egypt run on Inshallah.
The people say that nuclear electricity is most cost effective because it includes only immediate cost. It doesn't include disposal cost and getting for the environmental cost. It doesn't include anything.
The issue of transparency is what bothers me about the Middle East and other areas. People are not going to be included in the decision. You're quite right by saying it's prestige. But I live in those areas and I know how the world runs. And I leave. I mean, at least I have the ability to leave.
Let me just point out one thing. At least in the US, there has been a tax on every nuclear utility. When they produce a certain amount of electricity, they have to pay a tax to be able to take care of the spent fuel afterwards. The government has been collecting that money. They have over $70 billion, and they have not effectively found a way.
So what can I do?
Yeah. So, in some sense, it has been included. And the carbon tax that people talk about, which is not in place, that will be the counterpart of, for the same similar kind of tax on the coal, but that is not there. Whether that amount of money is sufficient or not, how bad is nuclear waste, those are issues that I said. I mean, these are open issues that we need to discuss. But for the nuclear fuel part, not so much the carbon part, but the cost of fuel is completely included. And but by the way, nuclear is not cheaper than coal.
I know. And this is what I'm like.
Yeah.
It's like, dude, just figure out the whole cycle.
Yeah, no.
Starting from the raw materials.
Even without, if you put your coal plant very close to a coal mine, then coal will be cheaper. Coal will be cheaper. But you saw the numbers. 2,000 pounds of coal going up into the air every time you turn the lights on for some amount of time versus some other problem. And if we want to talk about that, when the seawater rises, what happens in Bangladesh because of that CO2?
No,
what is
that's
the
a
cost
good
of
point.
that? Right? So that's what we need to be, and that's very difficult comparison.
So let's move to renewables. No fossil fuels, no nuclear.
That's the easy part.
Well, this gets us to the question of the difference between data transparency and actual calculability, right? So how, even if the Middle East was actually forthcoming, or Central Asia was actually forthcoming in their data, what is available of it, how could we actually make comparisons, particularly between, we've sort of heard a bit about sort of very clear economic comparisons. I spend quite a bit of time looking at sort of the local politics of natural resource extractions in and around mining areas. And there are things there that I'm not sure we know exactly how we would calculate, particularly when it comes to displacement, when it comes to rights violations, when it comes to a variety of socioeconomic and political dimensions that, even if we have all the transparency in the world, how could we possibly compare? So this leads me to my next question. What, if you had to name one, was the most important thing has been left out when it comes to thinking about evaluation of different forms of energy?
Yeah, I think ideal system is to put tax on the environmental damages or health damage. For example, Denmark put environmental taxes on carbon and also water, those resources, and pesticide, those environmentally damaging products. And so they put taxes, they incorporate those costs on the taxes. But if pesticides are too expensive, then people start not getting those products. And I think it's like a tobacco taxes here. It became so expensive, so people started quitting. So I think tax system is very effective. Don't you think? I want to introduce. I want for the United States to introduce carbon taxes so that that CO2 and carbon taxes also the environmental taxes so that nuclear power is going to be very expensive and also coal is going to be very expensive and instead of the renewable energy is going to be cheaper.
I think you're forgetting that there's a lot of people that say climate change is not a phenomenon. You have. Let's get back to the real world.
The issue of the interplay between the local politics and the regional and the countrywide politics and the global politics is very, very interesting. The most amount of support that you will hear about coal is around coal mines. The most amount of support for nuclear power is around where the nuclear power plants are, at least in the U.S.
Really?
Yeah.
Yes, I can attest to
Is
that.
that true?
Yeah, I mean,
Some of the
there's no
most
doubt.
expensive property in North Carolina is around our power plant.
The best school systems, the amount of money that those school systems get from those taxes from nuclear power plants, unbelievable. Everybody is very happy. But the nation has to decide in a different way what is good for the country. Sometimes because the options are not available. So the mines, the uranium mines in the Native American territories, okay, if you take that away, the only job that they have is gone. But there is a cost. Some regulation has to make sure that they're not, over excessively paying through their health the cost of that mining, right? But they are in general happy. I mean, they want those jobs.
I
coal miners, same thing
don't
with
think they
nuclear.
are happy. They don't have any choice.
Exactly. No.
Because
That's what I meant.
usually low income.
bad choice.
Yeah, low income community has to get those nuclear power plants because they get money so that they can survive.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to. They don't have any choices. But
It's interesting, the brownout issue. I mean, the inconvenience. I mean, I live in a brownout country. It's not convenient, man. I mean, you live, right? People live before electricity.
So actually, I've been wanting to bring the story. When I first moved to China in 1988, I moved into an apartment provided to me at great expense by my school in China. And I noticed it had a green rug with a big puddle in front of the refrigerator. It was an old water stain and a puddle. And I thought, whoa, what's that about? And after 2 days, I understood. Because every day the power would turn off for several hours and the refrigerator would defrost. Every day. Right? And that was just sort of factored into the cost of having a refrigerator under those circumstances. Right? But I actually wanted to say something entirely different. I think the main thing left out of this discussion of power is something called the car. Okay? And what I mean by that is, I think cars, I'm assuming that most of us got here today in a car, right? It isn't true that cars produce most of the pollution in the world, but car-structured cities, car-structured transportation systems, right? Car-based understandings of how people get to work, where they live, and all the rest, is so profoundly interwoven with all these other things. What are the main sources of energy? Hunger in many of these countries. is an increasing bourgeoisie that wants to be able to drive around freely, right? And I'm thinking about this because of the Tesla mania of the last week, right? An electric car is a great thing, except an electric car still needs electricity, and then we're back to do we produce it with coal or oil or something else, right? So it seems to me that, in fact, taking the car as a hidden constant, as an external variable, is a key problem with the way we evaluate energy alternatives, as we do now, and as we will in the future.
So it's transportation.
Absolutely, right?
Even long-distance transportation.
Absolutely. So if you go to Europe, if you go to East Asia, there's enormous investment in trains and trolleys and such. In the United States, some of you may know that General Motors participated in the ripping up of trolley tracks.
They got actually
in many cities.
convicted in a conspiracy in 1958 in Los Angeles.
Right?
And they fined $1.
For the convenience of selling more cars in the United States, and they also
And tires.
They also connived in the outmoding of bus systems, right? So I think the car is a hidden story here that we've mostly not addressed.
So I drove 2 hours from my house today, but I drive to sea, so it produces this CO2. Yeah. But how this country is built, it's so spread out. Because if I live in Evansville, and if when I want to come to this campus, without car, kind of impossible. There's no transportation here.
Yeah, but okay, that's
Public
your point is very well taken. Even if you convert that to electrical car, electricity has to be generated one way or another. And so whether it's a gas burning car or an electrical consumption car, transportation has a CO2 footprint somewhere or an energy footprint somewhere. So it's a point very well taken.
We discussed in the previous session having a large fleet of plug-in hybrids then allows you to buffer the variability of wind and solar in unique new ways. So, as much as I respect the immediate challenges of plug-in hybrids are, the long term has some interesting potential.
Yeah, I mean, once you have wind power, if you have storage, so nighttime wind power is still being produced, you're not consuming so much of it, you store, and then you charge up your car.
You can combine.
All kinds of, sure.
Yeah, geothermal, solar, small hydro.
First world problems.
So many.
Yeah.
This is not so much a question, but it's just tying up the first session with Gardner's paper on Central Asia. Azam talked about what would happen with salination and the problems of water in Iraq. This has actually happened in the Aral Sea, in the Bashkirt region of Uzbekistan when I was there 2 years ago. There is cancer, very tough. You cannot drink the water, and in fact the population is dying. I mean, again, there are no reliable numbers, but you don't go there. I mean, literally go there.
Yeah, you don't go there.
Unless you have to. You have to be crazy or very spiritual.
Just one thing about nuclear. If we didn't have the nuclear bomb, we wouldn't have nuclear energy. So this is another example of a wrong path that we shouldn't persevere on. And I'm not against nuclear per se, so I'm not somebody that, but it's, again, this is why we have. Otherwise, we would not have had it. So, and it's not clean, it's not cheap. As France now is trying to decommission the old nuclear plant, that will take 30 years. And if it wasn't about government capital, there will be no nuclear plants. We didn't even talk about security, not safety issues, because that's what the terrorists are after. So think about attacking a nuclear plant, which is what they will try to do. If you blow up a windmill, so what? I mean, these are very important issues, and there wouldn't be circulation of radioactive materials by terrorists. So for me, that is an extraordinary impact that we should think about. I also lived in Romania by the time of Chernobyl, and I have thyroid disease. Is it due to Chernobyl? I don't know. Nobody will count it. But there are major consequences. Again, low probability, very high catastrophic impact. So let's not, the expected value is bad. And I agree. Why dispute bad choices? History is history. We did coal, we did oil for this reason. It helped us develop. But now it's another time, and we do have other choices. And this problem of intermittence, it does not exist. And Denmark functions. Sweden functions. The whole city of Malmö is on renewable energy. And at what latitude is that? Above Canada. So things are solved, but there is much more nitpicking on renewable energy than there is on conventional ones. And on transportation, for me as a European, it is outrageous what we have here. Look, the greatest nation? No. Why couldn't I take a train from Indianapolis? I am forced to pollute. I don't want to drive my internal combustion engine car, but I don't have choices. At the same time, I'm not without any power. Do I pound the tables all the time for trains? Yes, absolutely. Do I even sacrifice to take a long time or sabotage flying, driving? So I do a lot of sacrifice because I believe in these things, and all of us should. Speaking about structuring the cities, I'm sorry, restructure them, right? Plan. You are not here, but I was showing the Blue Indy. Yes, rain or shine, I'm going to walk to my Blue Indy. During the weekend, I refuse to drive my car. I'll stay for 2 hours at the bus station. It's a matter of trying to build this new thing that you want others to join. And yes, Amtrak is absolutely boycotted in America, and we should oppose that. Again, through activism, through taking your representatives to task. Indianapolis had, 100 trains every day 100 years ago, and now it has one that barely makes it, and they want to kill that one too. So we are responsible. These choices don't just fall on us. We are responsible for accepting them or rejecting them. Flying is catastrophic, especially domestic flying, driving. And speaking of Tesla, they're also building the charging station. Or trains. There are places where you have solar panels along the rail tracks. Again, you can use for multiple purposes everything you have. You can put solar panels. Lotus Cars has a solar panel on the roof, right? Super sporty car. So if you want, you can get here. Even if there will be the stranded assets that Marian was talking about, I think at some point they will have, right, there's now so much talk that the more you invest in nuclear or in conventional, the higher the risk that you will have big stranded assets. And coal pretty much is the prime example of that, right? Coal is now going under. So let's substitute it with a real good choice. Let's not go through nuclear for it.
I have a question about the Japan Energy Mix. After Fukushima, you talked about that there was a large push into renewables.
No.
No.
No, like
1 year.
1 year.
1 year.
But there was,
Oh,
okay,
yes.
because it looked, you showed this much and then this much in terms of
4 years.
gigawatts, but it was still only 10%. It didn't move the.
By the way, all
did not
engineering
move the
projects
area.
have negative potentials. We have a dam in Iraq called Mosul Dam that is termed as the most dangerous dam in the world, and if it fails, there's 10 million people that are going to be affected. So everything has a risk.
How do you compare? That was my point. That how do you have to have some consistent way of coming to an agreement, and how do we compare the immediate consequences of these potentialities, right? What was the expected value, but then also the long-term consequences. Long-term consequences of nuclear cesium in tuna versus CO2 out in the atmosphere. How do you compare those two?
I'm not smart enough, thank God.
Okay, I think that we're.
Yeah, I'm going to go from top here. I'm going to ask you guys to keep this energy until after lunch when we have our day and summary conversation. We're going to invite anyone who's still here from our two panels to have a conversation together. Let me just stop recording real quick.